Well, as usual, I'm sat in my car. That's where I spend half of my life at this time of year. But I've just finished a week of Moorlands Matter events. I've been involved with them since 2021. So we did the first ones in 2021. We did 2. Last year we did 3. This year we are doing 4. And this year's got the first Lowland Ground event, which is good. So the basis of the events are that we invite a group of people from all different walks of life up to the uplands to a grouse lodge, and they stay in that lodge for 24 hours. This is the short version of it, but they arrive, we have lunch, we chat about whatever topics they want to talk about, whether that's wildlife, community, conservation that is happening in the uplands. And then this time we went up to a lunch hut and carried on that chat, so then they got to see some of the wildlife while they were up there. And then we go for a little safari drive, and this year they did a lek as well on the morning. So we did a little rehearsal of the lek the night before, so they knew what they were doing and where they were going. And then after the lek, we went back to the house, had a big breakfast, kind of conclude your chats and get any questions that anyone has. So that is the short version. But it's been really interesting. The 2 groups we had, the first group was just a big mixture of people. So some people who know a lot about shooting, some people who know not very much about shooting, and some people who are in between, not really convinced. Some people just did other field sports like deer stalking or fishing, or, it's definitely not a shooting event. And especially last year we had people who are quite opposed to shooting. So the whole idea is that you get all of these opinions around the table and you actually talk to each other face to face. It is Chatham House rules, so I can't necessarily talk in detail about things or name people, especially on the first event. So I think it was just one of the most interesting things about the first group, since it was such a mixture of people, was just people not really know. Like, I live here, I grew up here, I grew up on a farm, I went beating when I was a teenager, I worked in grouse lodges, I've worked grouse seasons, like, I understand shooting, I've spent time with keepers, some of my best friends are keepers, like, I obviously grew up in this world. So for me, it's just kind of second nature. Not saying I know everything, but I obviously know quite a bit because of that. And you realise when you meet different people that they don't know, and it's not their fault, they just haven't been educated, they haven't spent time up here. And it's actually really interesting to learn what people, either their perceptions are, or what they think, or what they believe, and what they just don't know. So we had a lot of talks about food actually on the first group, and one of the biggest points, which I hadn't necessarily thought of, is food from the moment it is shot on a shoot needs to be handled in a certain way, processed in a certain way, chilled in a certain way, etc. And just actually talking through that process, as I say, I didn't know masses about that. And it just made me think, obviously I did a picking up season, and it made me think of all the details of my picking up season. And for example, I didn't realise that you shouldn't necessarily, birds are usually, once they're collected, they're put onto like big trays, and there's usually maybe 2 layers of birds. So it was interesting talking to a chef who was there, and they said that's not necessarily correct, because those birds are obviously warm and they hold a certain amount of heat. So then when you have 2 birds together, they maintain that heat for longer. You get the picture. And then obviously they need to go to a chiller, they need to be processed correctly. And then we obviously got on about the lead steel conversation, which is a massive topic in the shooting industry, because eventually we're all going to be shooting steel, I imagine. Or that's what you're told by all of the shooting organisations. And there's pros and cons to both. So for people who don't know, lead is, it kills birds easier because it travels further and faster. This is my knowledge of it anyway. Which means it penetrates the bird more, which means it kills it easier. So in some ways that's great, because then you've got more chance of an outright kill, and then that bird is not suffering. Whereas lead is steel, doesn't necessarily do that, or that's what I thought. But then when you speak to people who actually know about cartridges, which I know nothing about because I don't shoot, there are cartridges out there which are better than others, and there's different steel options. So in reality, like my picking up season, me and other picker-uppers noticed that a lot of birds were wounded. So obviously you're picking them with your dogs, you notice how many come back wounded. And we thought, oh, that, that's not good, because you don't want that animal to suffer. But then I don't know what steel cartridges they were shooting. So were they just shooting the wrong cartridges, etc.? It brought up a lot of questions in my mind about steel, because in reality, if you shoot with steel, your birds can go into the food industry, and the food industry will take them because they can remove steel from a bird with a magnet. Whereas if you shoot lead has a certain amount of contamination in it, and supermarkets will not take it because it's shot with lead. And also it's harder to remove from the meat because I'm assuming it's not magnetic. I've never really tested it. But anyway, they can remove steel a lot easier and x-ray the meat and all the rest. So there is a certain part of me that's like, if we're going to change to steel, let's just do it, because then you have more of a reason. Those birds can then be put into the food industry. And for me, game is a fantastic alternative with food. I mean, it's, a lot of these birds, they live a wild life. When you think of your battery farm chickens or, intensively farmed things, which most of your supermarkets are selling. And also chicken is, I think it's got like 8% water pumped into it now. Every single chicken that you buy pretty much has that as a standard, because that's what everyone's doing. And I just think game has led a pretty wild life, even if it's pheasant or partridge. They've lived out in the woods with all their buddies, and they've definitely lived more of an organic lifestyle than a lot of the chicken that we eat, for example. And also we, which I didn't realise, import now masses of chicken. Even though we have it in this country, it's cheaper for us to import it. There's also the carbon side of how far your food has travelled. So that was that. This is probably going to be a long chat, but that was one of the main topics from the first group. And there was certainly an amount of anger that came from the first group in terms of how we feel as people who live in these hills, and we are told what you can do and what you can't do by people who don't necessarily live in these hills and have never been here. So we also had one of the gamekeepers came down to chat to us, and he told us about his experiences and his day-to-day life, and some of his experiences with getting licenses or policy changes, and it makes you realise how difficult gamekeepers' lives are made when they don't necessarily need to be. They are basically made that difficult because they're a gamekeeper, which I am aware of, but a lot of people aren't. So it was really good to speak to him and to get everyone to speak to him and ask their questions. And he was fantastic at answering them. And I think that's where the anger came in, because, the general population that actually have no view on shooting, when you hear that someone's life is being made really difficult when all they're doing is their job and managing a bit of ground. And while they're managing that bit of ground, I mean, we saw lapwings, which have got chicks, which are in the field in front of me. We've got curlews, oyster catchers, stone chats, wheat ears, meadow pipits, snipe. There was a pair of woodcock just in the yard even. Obviously black grouse, red grouse, all the grey hens are here. Merlins, we saw some merlins up the hill, sparrowhawks, quite a few sparrowhawks actually. There's a couple kestrels nesting up and down here because I see them every night. Short-eared owls, barn owls. I mean, the list goes on, and I know I've forgotten some species there. All of that is here because this land is managed, and that's the reality of it. And I think when people hear managed land and they hear predator control and they hear all of these terms that are used, they sound negative, when in reality, we as humans have unbalanced nature. That's the truth in it. And if you didn't control predators would just eat everything that was here and then end up dying of starvation. There are a lot of predatory species here that can breed very quickly. So yeah, I think people getting the reality of what actually goes on in these uplands made them quite angry, and also angry with the conservation industry, because they could all work together. They could all be much more friendly with each other and work together to help these species, but they don't, because shooting is involved, and that is the taboo subject, which drives you crazy really, because one of the main points that I made in my speech that I gave is that so many people focus on the 9 wealthy rich people that are shooting on a shoot day, and not the 80 or 100 plus locals that are employed on that shoot day. For me, growing up in that, growing up in Weardale, you know, a lot of families are supported by the shooting industry. A lot of businesses are supported, and I think people don't take that into account. You know, when you work on these larger estates, which are up here, you have a big house that is often painted, decorated, cleaned, and I'm not just talking like dusting, I'm talking like their carpets get cleaned, their curtains get taken down and washed and taken off to a business and cleaned, all the laundry goes off to a specific business and they do all their laundry. You know, they employ someone full-time to do all of the ironing and everything throughout the season. All of those keepers' cars are all managed by local garages. They're bought from local garages. They're maintained in local, you know, everything is local. A lot of their food supply is brought in from local businesses, and, you know, you're getting fruit from here, vegetables from here, meat from here. So the amount that goes into the community, even just taxis, we spoke to a taxi driver on these events, and they said during the shooting season, they constantly run taxis to all these lodges, constant, like they're booked out for 3 or 4 months. And that, for a local business around here, I mean, I can do a pan of where I'm sat currently. You know, there's not a lot here. You are in the middle of nowhere, and that's massive for all of these businesses. So yeah, that's one of my main points. We then go on to the second group, which I can talk a little bit more about, I think, but we had a full Scribehound group. So obviously this video is going to go out on Scribehound. So it was really nice to meet some of my fellow writers that I'd not met before. And even that, we obviously had people who understand quite a lot about shooting, but probably more about lowland shooting. So it was good to hear their views on what actually goes on up here and teach them a little bit more about the uplands and the differences. We also had some people who are, you know, in the farming industry, and I can't say too much because then I'll just give it all away who it is, but lots of countryside people who are not necessarily in shooting. And so we also talked a lot about farming, and obviously farming in the uplands is incredibly different to farming in lowland agriculture more areas. So yeah, it was good to talk about just the differences really, and how many differences there are. We even talked about farm subsidies, which are much more inclusive for lowland agricultural farmers than they are for upland farmers. So we had one of the other volunteers is Kaz Rain, and she has her own consultancy business for farming, and she told us all about the struggles that her farmers and her clients are having, in comparison to these subsidies that, you know, they cater much more for lowland farming. And I think on the second group, one of the biggest things that we talked about was actually a gamekeeper's job and talking about what they do. I think gamekeepers get really bad reps through the media because of their job, but in reality, you know, we spoke to a keeper again on the second group, and even just small things like, you know, they maintain the dry stone walls around here, they maintain the tracks, they litter pick, they, you know, their bit of ground that they work on, they are super proud to manage that bit of ground. And we also spoke about whether, whether they should be remarketed as wildlife managers, because some estates have done that and it's been a positive. But the general senses that I get from a lot of people that I speak to is that they're proud to be a gamekeeper. Sometimes their father was a gamekeeper or their grandfather, and they're proud to be a gamekeeper and they don't want to change their name, and I don't blame them for that. And I think people just don't realise the vast amount of things that a keeper actually does, and how in reality they're just they're a naturist as well and a conservationist as well. They know more about that specific piece of ground that they work on than anyone. Some of them have worked their bits of ground for 15, 20 years. They know their bit of ground. They know exactly what is on it. They know where everything nests, what every species is, And the sad reality is they're not taken into consideration when a new bit of legislation is brought out, or they're told what they should and shouldn't do on their land when they know what's best to do on their land in reality. So that was another big topic on the second group. So I think for me, I'll probably think of other subjects and have to film other points at home when I remember them. But I always get to this time of year and I see all of this wildlife that's incredible, and then I see people walking their dogs off lead near chicks, or people dropping litter out of their car windows, and it makes me want to not share this. It makes me want to keep these little pockets of wildlife that are incredible to myself in almost a selfish way. And I felt like that a week ago, and I was thinking, what am I going to write on Scribehound, and what is going to be my articles over the next few months. And I think these events have made me think, in reality, the only way we're going to save this and save these areas is actually to share it and to try and educate people and engage with people on it. I'm currently writing my article for Scribehound. It's a little bit late, but it's going to be done today. And I go back to the thing that David Attenborough said, which I think everyone has heard a million times, that if people don't know about this, then they're not going to care about it. So I think my newfound goal is probably to share it more and just share. I realised how little people know, and that's not being condescending, that's not being rude, it's not their fault, they're not here. But they don't necessarily know that, every detail of what these species do on these fells, or how well they parent, or the different calls that they call to their chicks to make them do different things, or what they're feeding them, or that an oyster catcher female will often sit on her nest, and as she hatches eggs one at a time, she kicks them out and gives them to the dad so that he can feed them while she hatches the others, whereas other birds don't do that. And I think because I spend so much time out here watching these animals, and I have for the past 4 or 5 years, I know and have filmed a lot of behaviours that people don't necessarily know about. Or we're currently doing a study with the North Pennines group, and we're finding that woodcock actually don't just nest in woods. We've found nests fully submersed in heather now, and well, I say we, it's not we, there's a group of people out there looking for nests, and they're doing a brilliant job, and I find it really interesting where they're finding these nests and where they're finding these woodcock. But it's just proof that if you allow people up on these estates and they're here to survey things, I think they would get a bit of a shock of what is actually here. This estate that I'm currently sat on thinks that this year they might have 100 black grouse, which is incredible. And the lek, I've been to a couple leks in the past few weeks, and most of them have had 15 grey hens on. I mean, I started going to see leks 4 years ago, and you'd get maybe 3 grey hens on the same bit of ground. Now we're up to 15. Like, that's incredible. That's an incredible success in 3 or 4 years. And they've actually expanded the black grouse population so much just with habitat management, making sure they don't get disturbed, and predator control, that they're now creating new leks because there's so many males that the younger ones are doing their own leks. So for me, that's an incredible conservation story. But because it's on a grouse moor, it's almost dismissed, which is a massive shame. So once again, this video is going to be filled with all kinds of footage, which was all taken on this estate in the past week. And I hope it makes people care more about upland wildlife and conservation. That is my new aim, I think. So yeah. And if you want to come to a Why Moorlands Matter, or you think that you know people who'd be really good for it, or you have a business that is involved in conservation or management of any, then get in touch, drop me a message. There is a website hopefully going to be done soon so that people can go and visit that website, but for now, drop me a message. I can put you in touch with whoever you want, and you can come up and experience it for yourself.